In this video, we take an in-depth look at the case of Colt Gray, the teenager who admitted responsibility for the deadly shooting at Apalachee High School. We'll examine how the events unfolded, what investigators discovered, the warning signs that drew national attention, the evidence presented in court, and the sentence that concluded the criminal case. Hello everyone, and welcome back to MF True Crime. How does an ordinary school morning become one of the deadliest days in a community's history? Not with a warning siren, not with a dramatic confrontation. According to investigators, it began like countless other mornings. Students walked through the front doors of Apalachee High School in Winder, Georgia. Teachers prepared for another day of classes. Hallways filled with conversations about homework, sports, and weekend plans. There was no obvious sign that within minutes, lives would be changed forever. Then, the first emergency calls reached dispatch. Inside the school, confusion spread faster than information. Some students believed they had heard lockers slam shut. Others thought balloons had popped somewhere down the hallway. But as teachers rushed to secure their classrooms, the reality became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a drill. According to investigators, gunfire had erupted inside the school. Within moments, law enforcement officers from multiple agencies raced toward the campus, while students and staff barricaded doors, hid beneath desks, and searched desperately for safety. By the time the shooting ended, 4 people had been killed: teachers Richard Aspinwall and Christina Irami, and students Mason Schermerhorn and Christian Angulo. 9 others were injured. An ordinary Wednesday morning had become one of the darkest days in Georgia's recent history. As the campus was secured, another question immediately emerged. Who was responsible? Investigators quickly identified the suspect as 14-year-old Colt Gray, a student at the school. He was taken into custody at the scene without being shot by responding officers. The speed of the arrest answered one question, but it raised many more. How had a teenager allegedly carried out such an attack inside a school? Where had the firearm come from? And could anything have prevented what happened? Those questions would soon become just as significant as the shooting itself. As investigators began processing the crime scene, another discovery shifted the direction of the case. This wasn't the first time Colt Gray's name had appeared on law enforcement's radar. Nearly a year before the shooting, authorities had investigated online threats connected to a school shooting. The inquiry ended without criminal charges. At the time, investigators said they did not have enough evidence to establish that a crime had been committed. But after the attack at Apalachee High School, that earlier investigation came under intense public scrutiny. People wanted to know whether warning signs had been missed, or whether the tragedy could ever have been prevented. The investigation that followed would uncover more than forensic evidence. It would examine family decisions, access to firearms, mental health concerns, and eventually something almost unheard of in an American school shooting case. Not only would the teenager face prosecution, his father would also be charged in connection with the events leading up to the attack. Then, nearly 2 years later, the criminal case reached its final chapter. Colt Gray stood before a judge, pleaded guilty, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before the courtroom reached that moment, investigators first had to answer a far more immediate question. What exactly happened inside Apalachee High School that morning? And what evidence convinced prosecutors they could prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt? How do investigators piece together just a few minutes when those minutes change so many lives forever? Not from a single witness, not from a single camera. They reconstruct the timeline one fragment at a time. Every classroom, every hallway, every 911 call, every statement. Together, those fragments would become the foundation of the criminal case. According to investigators, the attack unfolded during the morning of the 4th of September, 2024, inside Apalachee High School. Students and teachers who had started the day expecting ordinary lessons suddenly found themselves making life or death decisions. Some locked classroom doors. Others switched off lights and remained silent behind desks. Many had no idea where the gunfire was coming from. They only knew it was getting closer. As officers entered the building, their priority wasn't identifying a suspect. It was stopping the threat before more lives were lost. The gunfire stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. Officers moved through the hallways expecting the possibility of another confrontation. According to investigators, they instead encountered a 14-year-old student who surrendered. The immediate danger was over. The investigation was only beginning. According to investigators, Colt Gray surrendered without exchanging gunfire with law enforcement. The immediate danger was over, but the crime scene was only beginning to reveal what had happened. Inside the school, detectives documented evidence room by room, while forensic teams photographed every detail. Those findings would later help prosecutors reconstruct the sequence of events presented in court. Among the victims were two educators who had dedicated their careers to teaching. Richard Aspinwall, a mathematics teacher and assistant football coach, and Christina Iremi, a mathematics teacher remembered by students and colleagues for her commitment to education. They were joined by two students whose futures ended far too soon. Mason Schermerhorn, 14 years old, and Christian Angulo, also 14. 9 other people survived with injuries. For investigators, every victim represented more than a statistic. Each location inside the school helped establish where people had been, how the attack unfolded, and how quickly it had happened. As detectives examined the evidence, another question became increasingly important. Where had the firearm come from? That question wasn't simply about identifying a weapon. It would eventually shape an entirely separate criminal case. Investigators alleged that the rifle used in the shooting had been given to Colt Gray by his father, Colin Gray, months before the attack. That allegation dramatically expanded the scope of the investigation. For prosecutors, the case was no longer focused solely on the actions of a 14-year-old. It now included the decisions made by an adult who, they alleged, had provided access to the weapon, despite warning signs. Colin Gray has since been convicted in his own criminal case, which is legally separate from his son's proceedings. But investigators weren't finished. As they reviewed digital evidence and previous law enforcement records, they discovered something that changed the public conversation surrounding the case. This wasn't the first time authorities had encountered concerns involving Colt Gray. Months before the shooting, a report of online threats had already prompted an investigation. At the time, no charges were filed. After the tragedy, however, that earlier encounter became one of the most closely examined aspects of the entire case. Long before prosecutors filed charges, long before a courtroom heard evidence, investigators found themselves revisiting something from the previous year. A report, an interview, a warning at the time. It hadn't led to criminal charges. After the shooting, it became one of the most scrutinized decisions in the entire investigation. If authorities had already investigated potential warning signs, why wasn't this tragedy prevented? That question would lead investigators back nearly a year long, before the first shot was ever fired. What if the story didn't begin at Apalachee High School? What if investigators discovered that the warning signs had appeared months before the shooting, but no crime had been committed, at least none they could prove? That question would become one of the most closely examined aspects of the entire case. Because after the shooting, investigators weren't only trying to understand what happened, they were trying to determine whether it could have been prevented. Nearly a year before the attack, law enforcement officers had already spoken with Colt Gray. The first clue didn't come from a crime scene. It came from a computer screen, an anonymous tip, a threatening online post. At first, it looked like one of countless reports received every year. The post referred to an attack at a middle school and mentioned that it would happen soon. According to investigators, the online account was traced to an address associated with Colt Gray's family. That discovery prompted federal authorities to notify local law enforcement in Georgia. Suddenly, what had started as an online tip became an in-person investigation. When investigators visited the family's home, they interviewed both Colt Gray and his father, Colin Gray. According to the sheriff's office, Colt denied making the threatening posts. His father acknowledged that Colt had access to firearms for hunting and recreation, but said he did not believe his son posed a threat to anyone. Investigators searched for evidence connecting Colt directly to the online account. They couldn't establish that connection. Without sufficient evidence identifying who had made the posts, no criminal charges were filed. The investigation was closed. At the time, the case appeared to end there. Then came the 4th of September, 2024. Everything changed. What had once been an unresolved online threat investigation was suddenly viewed through an entirely different lens. People asked whether authorities had missed warning signs. Others questioned whether law enforcement had done everything legally possible based on the information available at the time. In the days after the shooting, investigators found themselves reopening a file they had once closed. The same interview, the same address, the same questions, except now 4 people were dead. According to public records, investigators acted on the information they had, interviewed the family, and found insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. That distinction would become an important part of the public conversation after the shooting. But investigators uncovered something else. The focus gradually shifted away from online posts and toward access to the firearm itself. According to prosecutors, the rifle allegedly used in the shooting had been given to Colt Gray by his father months after the earlier law enforcement interview. That allegation fundamentally changed the scope of the investigation. It was no longer only about the actions of a 14-year-old. It became a case examining the legal responsibilities of a parent. For the first time in Georgia, prosecutors pursued criminal charges against a parent in connection with a school shooting allegedly carried out by their child. It was a decision that drew national attention and raised new legal questions about accountability. Meanwhile, Colt Gray's own criminal case moved steadily through the courts. The evidence collected inside Apalachee High School, the witness statements, the forensic findings, and the digital evidence gathered during the investigation all became part of the prosecution's case. Eventually, rather than proceed to a jury trial, Colt Gray made a decision that changed the course of the proceedings. He pleaded guilty to all 55 criminal charges. That plea meant there would be no trial to determine guilt. But one critically important question still remained. There would be no jury deciding guilt. That chapter was over, but another decision remained, one that no guilty plea could answer. How should the justice system sentence a 14-year-old who admitted to one of Georgia's deadliest school shootings? The answer would come from a courtroom filled with families who had waited nearly 2 years to be heard. Sometimes the most important moment in a criminal case isn't a verdict. It's the moment when there will never be one. Nearly 2 years after the shooting at Apalachee High School, the courtroom prepared for a trial that many believed would determine one of the most consequential juvenile murder cases in recent American history. Jurors would never hear the evidence. There would be no opening statements, no cross-examinations, no deliberations, because before the trial could begin, Colt Gray made a decision that changed everything. For prosecutors, the guilty plea did not lessen the impact of the crimes. During the sentencing hearing, they presented evidence designed to explain not only what happened that morning, but the devastating consequences that continued long after the shooting ended. Victims' families described lives permanently altered. Survivors spoke about physical injuries, emotional trauma, and memories they said would never leave them. Teachers, students, first responders, and investigators all became part of a record that extended far beyond the events of a single morning. The hearing was no longer about establishing guilt. It became an opportunity for the court to understand the lasting human cost of the attack. For several days, the courtroom heard 2 very different narratives. One focused on the lives that had been taken. The other focused on the life that had led the defendant to that courtroom. Neither erased the other. The judge was required to weigh both. The law demanded accountability, but it also required the court to consider mitigating evidence before imposing sentence. It was one of the most difficult responsibilities any trial judge can face. Then came the moment every person inside the courtroom had been waiting for. Families of the victims, survivors, investigators, lawyers, and Colt Gray himself. Judge Nicholas Prim prepared to announce a sentence that would determine how the remainder of Gray's life would be spent. It was a decision that would close one chapter of this case, but not necessarily the conversation surrounding it. The courtroom had finally reached its answer, a sentence that ensured Colt Gray would spend the rest of his life in prison. For many families, it brought a measure of legal closure. But outside that courtroom, another criminal case was still moving through the justice system, one that asked a question no Georgia court had ever answered before. Could a parent also be held criminally responsible for a school shooting carried out by their child? Can any sentence ever feel proportionate after a tragedy like this? For nearly 2 years, that question lingered over the case. The investigation had ended, The guilty plea had been entered. The victims' families had spoken. The defense had presented its case for mitigation. Now, there was only one decision left. Judge Nicholas Prim began delivering the sentence. Inside the courtroom, there was no uncertainty about what had already been established. Colt Gray had admitted his guilt. The court's responsibility was no longer to determine what happened. It was to decide how justice should respond. After considering the evidence, the victim impact statements, the defense's mitigation arguments, and the applicable law, Judge Prim imposed the maximum sentence permitted. The courtroom fell quiet. Families who had waited nearly 2 years looked toward the bench. Survivors sat only a few feet away. Reporters stopped typing. Everyone already knew guilt had been established. No one yet knew how the judge would answer the final question. Then, Judge Nicholas Prim began reading the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gray would spend the remainder of his life in the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections. There would be no release date. No future parole hearing. No opportunity to ask a parole board for another chance. The sentence reflected the court's conclusion that permanent imprisonment was the appropriate legal consequence for the crimes to which Gray had pleaded guilty. For the criminal case against Colt Gray, the courtroom proceedings had reached their conclusion, but sentencing marked different endings for different people. For prosecutors, it closed one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Georgia's recent history. For investigators, it brought to an end an inquiry that had begun with a frantic emergency response and evolved into one of the most closely examined school shooting investigations in the country. For the families of Richard Aspinwall, Christina Irami Mason Schermerhorn, and Christian Angulo, no sentence could restore what had been lost. Throughout the sentencing hearing, many described birthdays that would never again be celebrated, empty chairs at family gatherings, and futures that disappeared in a matter of minutes. The sentence concluded the legal process. It could not erase the consequences that remained outside the courtroom. The defense, meanwhile, had asked the court to look beyond the crime itself. Their mitigation case argued that Gray's age, upbringing, family instability, and mental health struggles should be weighed alongside the seriousness of the offenses. Those arguments were fully presented during the sentencing hearing, but after considering all of the evidence, the court concluded that they did not justify a lesser sentence. The law required the judge to consider both aggravating and mitigating circumstances. The final ruling reflected how the court balanced those competing considerations. Yet even as the sentence was announced, one aspect of the case continued to draw national attention. The investigation had never focused solely on Colt Gray. It had also examined the decisions made before the shooting, specifically, how a 14-year-old gained access to the rifle prosecutors said was used in the attack. That question led to an unprecedented prosecution against Colin Gray, Colt Gray's father. In a separate criminal case, Colin Gray was convicted on charges arising from allegations that he knowingly allowed his son access to the firearm, despite warning signs. Today, the criminal proceedings against Colt Gray have concluded. The sentence is final unless altered through future appellate or post-conviction proceedings. But the case continues to raise difficult questions that extend beyond a single courtroom. What responsibilities do parents have when warning signs emerge? What can schools, law enforcement, and communities realistically do when threats are reported, but cannot yet be proven? And perhaps the most difficult question of all. The court answered one question. It determined the sentence. It could not answer another. How do you stop a tragedy before it becomes a crime scene? That question remains. When does a criminal case truly end? Is it when the investigation is complete? When a guilty plea is entered? Or when a judge announces a sentence? For the justice system, Colt Gray's case has reached its conclusion. He pleaded guilty to all charges, and the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal questions surrounding his criminal responsibility have now been answered. But beyond the courtroom, many questions remain. The case reignited a national conversation about school safety, early intervention, access to firearms, and the responsibilities of parents when warning signs emerge. It also became one of the first major cases in Georgia to be accompanied by the separate criminal prosecution of a parent, highlighting the evolving legal debate over accountability in school shootings. For the families of Richard Aspinwall, Christina, Jeremy, Mason Schermerhorn, and Christian Angulo, however, no sentence could restore what was taken from them. Perhaps that is the lasting legacy of the Apalachee High School case. Not simply the sentence imposed, but the difficult questions it leaves behind. Questions about prevention, questions about responsibility, and questions about how communities recognize warning signs before they become tragedies. Those debates will likely continue long after the courtroom has emptied. The legal case may be over. Its impact is not. Thank you for watching. If you appreciate carefully researched, evidence-based true crime documentaries, please support MF True Crime by subscribing and turning on notifications. Your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth investigations and factual crime stories. Until next time, thank you for watching and stay safe.